In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a disintegration effect in Photoshop. Hi, welcome back to the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. I'm Jesus Ramirez. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create the disintegration effect in Photoshop. We're basically going to replicate the effect that you saw in the Avengers Infinity War movie. It's a really neat effect, and we're going to take advantage of Photoshop's brushes and patterns. And even though you may never need to create this effect, the techniques that you're going to learn in this tutorial are very valuable if you want to learn how to create effects in Photoshop. Also, this tutorial takes advantage of many tools and features, so it might be a good idea to watch the tutorial first, take notes, and then watch it again and follow along. Okay, let's get started. This is the document that we're going to start with. And just to let you know, I have 3 layers. I have a background layer and this foreground element, which has already been extracted from its background. So when you follow this tutorial and work on your effect, make sure that you are working with a foreground element without a background like this one. Also, I have this gray background. It's simply a solid fill layer, and I like having this gray background because it allows me to see the foreground element without any distractions from the background. So I will be enabling this layer on and off throughout the tutorial, and this is simply a solid color adjustment layer which was set to gray. Also, I would like to point out that the background image is an image that I blurred with the Gaussian blur, and I also use Camera Raw to make tonal adjustments. This is a smart object, so I can make adjustments if I need to. And I match the foreground element to the background using techniques that you've already seen in a different tutorial. I'm not going to go through those techniques in this tutorial just to save a little bit of time and so that we can focus on the dispersion effect. However, if you want to learn how to match your foreground element to your background element, I have 2 tutorials that you can watch on that. I have a quick 90-second tip where I show you how to do this with a curves adjustment layer, and a longer tutorial where I show you how to match each component manually: luminosity, saturation, and hue. So I recommend those tutorials if you want to learn how to match your foreground element to your background. But anyway, these are the layers that we're going to use for this tutorial. And the first thing that we're going to do is create a brush. This brush is going to help us create the dispersion effect. So I'm going to go into this file here. It is a stock image that I found of charcoal up against the white background. Unfortunately, I can't provide this image since it is a stock image and I don't have the rights to provide it for free. It is an Adobe stock image. I can place a link down below in the description where you can download it and license it if you like, or you can download a free watermark version for this. What I will do, however, is provide the brush that I create so that you could use it in your projects. So learn the steps, use your own image, and if you don't want to go through the steps, that's fine. You can download the brush that I will be creating. But anyway, this is the image that I'm going to use to create a brush. And to create brushes, we need a white background and a dark element in the foreground, which is what we have here. And we don't really need to do much work. All we really need to do is when you have an image like this where the background is white and the foreground element is dark, is simply go into Edit, Define Brush Preset, then give your brush a name. The name really doesn't matter. In this case, I'll simply call it Distortion. Then I'll press OK, and now I have a brush based on this image. If I go back into the file where I have my foreground and background, I can simply create a new layer on top of that, and I can paint. So you can see that I can click and paint. Now the great thing about this is that I can now use Photoshop's brush settings to adjust my brush and make it even more powerful. So I'm going to delete this layer by tapping the delete key on the keyboard, and I'm going to create another layer. Then I'm going to click on this icon here to bring up the brush settings, and I can start with the brush tip and I can adjust the spacing. Notice the preview window here. Any adjustments that I make to the brush settings will be displayed in the brush preview. So if I increase the spacing, watch how the spacing of the brush increases. Now when I paint, and by the way, I'm going to make the size smaller, so I'm going to click and drag this down just so that it's more manageable. So when I paint, you can see my brush stroke there. And I'm actually going to change the foreground color to white just so that my brush stroke is easier to see. The color really doesn't matter. What we're doing right now is adjusting the brush so that we could use it for the effect that we want. And by the way, as you're watching this tutorial, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down below. Either myself or somebody else will answer them for you. Also, if I show you something that you like, click on that like button. It really helps me out. But anyway, we're going to work with the shape dynamics now. And I'm going to increase the size jitter, which increases the variance of brush marks in your brushstroke. Notice now that when I paint, all the brush marks are different sizes, making it seem more random. I'll now increase the angle jitter. The angle jitter rotates the brush mark, making the brush even more random when you paint. And I'm just going to delete this layer and create a new one. And this is what my brush looks like now. I'll now increase the roundness jitter to make my brush marks even more random. When I paint, it looks like that. I'm going to increase the scattering to scatter the brush strokes a little bit. I think that's a bit much, so I'll bring down the scatter. And that's looking much, much better. Remember that you can increase and decrease the size of your brush by using the bracket keys on your keyboard. And this is looking really good. And now that I've made these changes, I can collapse the brush panel and I can delete this layer and we're going to start from scratch. And what I'm going to do now is create a layer mask, and I'm going to paint with black on this layer mask to hide parts of the model. So notice that I'm painting and you see how he starts disappearing. This is how we're going to create that disintegration effect. Also, as I'm working, I'm going to be pressing the right bracket key to increase the size of my brush and the left bracket key to decrease the size of my brush. Also, I'm going to enable the gray background so that it makes it easier to see what I'm hiding on the layer mask. So I'm going to start painting, and I'm going to go fairly quickly here, but in your image, you should spend some time fine-tuning and deciding what areas are going to be hidden. And remember, this is non-destructive, so you can always come back and make changes if you need to. Remember that black conceals, which is what we're doing now. We're hiding pixels by painting with black on the layer mask. But if you want to bring back any of those pixels that you hid, you can switch the foreground color to white and paint on the layer mask to reveal those pixels again. And for the purposes of saving time, I'm going fairly quickly here, but in your project, take your time and try to get the details right. But anyway, so now we have the basis for the disintegration effect. What I'm going to do now is create one more layer and place that below the model. Open the foreground color picker by double clicking on it, and I'm going to change my foreground color to a dark brown. Now the effect that I'm going for is very similar to the effect seen in the Avengers Infinity War movie, which means that the particles will be brown. So that's what I want, a dark brown, and I'm just gonna paint alongside the edges just so that we can get these particles, and it makes it seem as if our model is disintegrating. And again, I'm using the bracket keys on the keyboard to increase and decrease the size of my brush as I'm painting. And there's no right or wrong as to where you paint or how you paint. Be creative and come up with something that looks good to your eye. And remember, don't worry about getting everything right. You can always come back and fine-tune the image later. And I think I will just put a little more in the hair right up here, like so. Now I'm going to select the model, then I'm going to click on the new layer icon, and we're going to continue painting. With the brush tool active, you can hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and it will temporarily enable the eyedropper tool, and you can hover over the image and click to select the color. For example, the red in his shirt. Then you can paint with the color that you select, and this will help create a more realistic disintegration effect. What I'm going to do now is repeat this process over and over again in different areas of the image. So remember, hold Alt, Option on the Mac, click to select the color, and then paint. And just do that on all the edges of the model. Sometimes you may have to undo and try again. And that's the key of a composite like this. You have to keep fine-tuning the image until it looks good to your eye. And these are the particles that are disintegrating when they're barely leaving his body. What we have to do now is work on the particles that are much further away from his body once they have turned into brown. So, open the foreground color picker by double-clicking on it, then select a dark brown. Press OK, and create a new layer. Just because if I make a mistake, I can always come back and make changes to the layer that contains the mistake. So always try to work with different layers. So for now, this is going to be a darker color. Disintegration effect here is going up into the air like so. And I'm doing it fairly quickly. So in your image, spend a little more time fine-tuning the details. Then I'm going to go for a darker color, a darker brown, and do the same thing. Just add more of those particles leaving his body. They're going up into the air, and keep painting. Then do a third pass with light brown. There's highlights as well. So open up the color picker and select the light brown color and continue painting. When you're done, you can disable the gray background layer just so that you could see what the effect is looking like up against the background that we're going to use. And it's all looking pretty good. And by the way, if you're following along and you make something using this tutorial, upload it to Instagram with the hashtag PTCvids. I would love to see what you come up with. Now I'm going to disable these layers and we're going to work on something else. So for now, I'll leave these layers disabled. And I'm going to open up this image here, which we're going to use to create a pattern of cracks in our image. So it looks like the skin in the body is cracking, it's breaking apart, is disintegrating. So we're going to use this texture here. Once again, this is an Adobe stock image. I'll place a link to the image right below in the description, or you can download the pattern that I create and use that in your project. And what I'm going to do now is show you a trick that you can use to create seamless patterns. There's not going to be a seam, a line that shows where the pattern is. And that's going to help us create the effect that we're going for. So to create a seamless pattern in Photoshop, you need to go into Filter, Other, and Offset, which will offset the image. So by default, you have the regular image, obviously. And if I increase the horizontal offset, notice how I'm offsetting the image and the pixels are wrapping around the other side. So the edge is here. See that? That's where the edge was. And instead of the edge being on the edge where it was originally, we pushed it to the center. So now we can see the seam, and I can do that for the vertical axis as well. So here we have the seams of the horizontal and vertical lines, and you can see those there. So what I'm going to do now is just simply press OK, and I can use different tools like the spot healing brush tool to just click and drag and remove that seam. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. If it looks okay, then you can just stop there and continue. Or you can use the clone stamp tool to clone pixels. All you need to do is hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click to select a sample source. Then you can paint those pixels to try to remove any visible seams on your image. In this case, this texture is going to be really, really small, so I don't really need to worry about seams, and I think that for now, this will work. Then go into the Channels panel, and we're going to use Channels to make a selection around the cracks. So go through each individual channel and see which channel has more contrast between the cracks and the dirt. In this case, the red channel has more contrast. So with that channel selected, I can just click and drag it into the new channel icon to duplicate it. If I press Ctrl-I, Command-I on the Mac, I invert those colors. The reason that I'm inverting is so that the dark pixels become white. And I want the dark pixels to become white because white is what we keep with a layer mask. And you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. So with this layer selected, I can go into Image, Adjustment, Levels, and I can just make the dark pixels darker by clicking and dragging the black point to the right, and the bright pixels brighter by clicking and dragging the white point to the left. So something like that should work, and you can always fine-tune the midpoint as well. When you're done, you can press OK. Then I can hold Control, that's Command on the Mac, and click on the red copy icon to load those pixels as a selection. Then I can click on RGB, go into Layers panel, and on that background layer, I'm just going to create a layer mask, and notice how we created an image that only contains the cracks and everything else is transparent. With the layer thumbnail active, I can go into Edit, Define Pattern, I can call it Cracks, and press OK. So now I have a seamless pattern of cracks. So I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to go into the dispersion effect file that we've been working with, and on top of the model layer, I'm just going to create a pattern. And you can see how that's the pattern there. Notice how we have a seamless pattern. And the best thing about this is that I can change the scale to say 50 or 25 or whatever works. I'll leave it at 25, press OK. Then I'll change the blending mode to multiply. And I'm just going to press Ctrl-Alt-G, Command-Option-G on the Mac to clip it to the layer below. That means that the layer of the model controls the visibility of the pattern layer. So that pattern will only be visible on top of the model. And what I'm going to do now is on the pattern fill layer mask, I'm going to select it and then click on invert to make it black. So all the pixels will be hidden, but I can selectively bring pixels back by painting with white on that layer mask. So I'm going to zoom in by pressing the Z key and clicking, and I'm going to paint with white on that layer mask. Let me select the soft brush. I have a soft brush right here. And when I paint, notice how I just bring back those cracks. So you can selectively paint the cracks back in the areas that you think require it. So I'm just painting those cracks right back into his body. And they're more noticeable in the areas where the disintegration effect has already started affecting his body. And once again, there's no right or wrong as to where you paint the cracks. It's totally up to you, whatever looks good to your eye. And once again, the best thing about this technique is that if I change my mind, I can double click on that pattern fill layer and I can change the scale back to 100 or 50 or 25 or anything smaller or bigger, whatever works for your image. I'll press OK and I'll double click on the hand tool to zoom out, and I'll enable all the other layers again just to see the effect that we have so far. Then I'll click on the eye icon to disable the gray background, and this is what our disintegration effect is looking like so far. What I'll do now is add dust, and I'm going to create a new layer on top of the layer stack, and I'll use a brush for that. Now, I already have a clouds brush that I created in a different tutorial. I'll place a link down below in the description where you can see that tutorial and how to get this clouds brush, but essentially it's the same process that you saw earlier. We take a photo and we turn it into a brush. In this case, clouds/smoke brush. So with this brush selected, I'm going to use white as the foreground color, and I'm just going to increase the size of the brush, and I'm just going to paint in a few of these brush strokes. And this is just to replicate a dust effect. And to change the color of the dust, I'm going to create a hue and saturation adjustment layer. Click on the clip and mask icon so that this adjustment layer only affects the dust layer. And I should have been naming my layers, but that's okay. We'll just continue. So this is my hue and saturation adjustment layer, and I can click on colorize, and I can increase the saturation, reduce the lightness, and you should see once I start adjusting the hue, the color will appear over the dust. And we're looking for a brown yellowish color to simulate the dust. And I can adjust the saturation and the lightness to get the color that I want. If your dust is too intense, you can always bring down the opacity, or you can create a layer mask on that dust layer and then paint with black to hide some of the dust. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. And like I said before, in a composite like this one, the details is the most important part. You've already learned all the techniques that I used to create the final image that you saw earlier in the tutorial. So remember, the magic is in the details, so spend your time fine-tuning your image until it looks the way that you want it to look. And actually another thing that you can add is an overlay. So I have this dust particle overlay on one of my Creative Cloud libraries. So I can drop it in there, rotate it, then flip it horizontal and just match the particles onto the model. I'm going to scale it up by clicking and dragging on the corner handles and adjust it accordingly. Then I'm going to commit the changes by pressing Enter, that's return in the Mac, and I'm going to change the blending mode to screen. The screen blending mode hides dark pixels and reveals the bright ones. So we're hiding all the black and only keeping the particles that are flying through the air. And you can always adjust how a layer blends by going into Image, Adjustment, and Levels, and changing the luminosity of the image. So you can fine-tune these points to get a better blend for your image. And I could also use the same trick of using Image, Adjustment, Hue and Saturation, check Colorize, adjust the lightness, saturation, and hue to change the color of the dust particles. Now we're going to adjust the image as a whole. So we're going to put everything into one single smart object, select the topmost layer, scroll down, hold Shift, and click on the bottommost layer, and right-click and select Convert to Smart Object. That's going to put all of that into a single layer, and I can go into Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and I can apply some very interesting effects to make everything look much better. So what I'm going to do here is increase the temperature just a little bit to warm things up. Then I'm going to adjust the highlight slider to bring up the highlights, make the shadows brighter as well to try to get more detail in there. And I can use the clarity slider to add more contrast in the midtones just to make the image pop a little more. And I can also increase the vibrance slider. Vibrance is a smart way of saturating images. Vibrance protects highly saturated pixels and skin tones, so it adds more saturation to pixels that don't have saturation and that are not skin tones. Then I can also increase the sharpening. Sharpening adds, of course, a sharpening effect to your image. And the trick about sharpening is if you add a lot of sharpening, it's going to obviously over sharpen the image. But to make sure that you get an accurate representation of what you're doing, go into the 100% view and hold Alt, Option on the Mac, and click on the masking slider. Notice that by default everything is white, which means that the sharpening effect is applied to everything, but if you click and drag to the right, some areas become black. So Camera Raw is finding the edges, and the edges, which are things in white, are the only areas that are going to have that sharpening effect applied to. So just fine-tune the amount slider and the masking slider to get the best sharpening possible. Then go into the Effects tab and add a little bit of grain to your image. I like adding grain because it makes composites feel more cohesive. Also for this image, I'm going to add a vignette. So I'm going to drag the vignette slider to the left. And to make sure that I see everything, I'm going to fit the image to screen, and I'll adjust the vignette accordingly. And then I'll press OK. So that's before and after. And if you need to fine tune anything, all you need to do is double click on the smart object to open it up and make an adjustment. For example, if I decide that this layer is just way too bright, then I can select it, go into Image, Adjustment, Levels, and just adjust the brightness of that layer just to make it a little bit darker. Press OK. If I click on this X, Photoshop will ask me if I want to save the smart object. If I click on yes, it will save it and it will update it on the smart object for the document that we're working with. You can also edit the adjustments that you made in Camera Raw by double clicking on the Camera Raw label on the smart object in the Layers panel. Now let me show you what my final file looks like. Remember, I used the same techniques that I showed you just now, but I spent a little more time fine-tuning the details. So I'm going to start enabling layers here so that you can see. Let me enable the layer mask. You can hide or show a layer mask by holding Shift and clicking, so you can see what I deleted off the model. This is the disintegration behind the model, and more disintegration effects. I actually used 2 cracked layers instead of 1, and what I did on the second one is simply used one with a scale of 75, and I moved it around accordingly until I had some cracks right here next to his face. Also, I decided to use the overlay blending mode instead of multiply. It just looked a little bit better. You can decide which blending mode looks best with your image. Also more details and more disintegration, dust, the color, and the particles. In this case, I use 4 different dust particle layers instead of 1 like you saw me do in the tutorial just now. But I just duplicated the layer several more times and distorted it and applied it accordingly. And then I have the final version here. So like I said, the magic is in the details. This composite here took me a little over an hour, and you saw me complete it in the tutorial while explaining it in about 22 minutes, and you can see the difference. Obviously, while explaining things and not looking at details, things don't look as good. So spend some time, look at the details, There's a lot of undoing and fine-tuning, and that's okay. Let me know in the comments which of these techniques you found the most useful, or if you're planning on creating your own disintegration effect. Also, if this is your first time at the Photoshop training channel, then don't forget to click on that subscribe and notification buttons. If you decide to create something using this technique, don't forget to share it on Instagram with the hashtag PTCvids. Thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again in the next tutorial.